From MSRC, the Moorland-Spingarn Research Center, on the campus of Howard University, I am Dr. Benjamin Talton, and this is On the Yard, a podcast that uses MSRC's archival collections to shape conversation, explore stories, and uncover the ideas that drive change, and celebrate the history and culture that define the global Black experience. This is the 9th and final episode of Season 1 of the On the Yard podcast. We've had exciting conversations on a wonderful array of topics that I believe prove the point that we present our introduction. Howard University, its history, its culture, is a window into the global Black experience. So to close Season 1, we decided to add video. You will watch and listen to my conversation with my Howard University colleague, Dr. Ibram X. Kendi. We discussed his experience growing up in New York City and Manassas, Virginia, his time as a student at Florida A&M University, his Howard journey, and his most recent book, Chain of Ideas. I'm confident that you will enjoy this conversation. But listeners, I have to apologize for the quality of Dr. Kendi's audio. The volume is low and the sound is muffled at times, just a bit. But that said, these technical shortcomings in no way take away from the quality of what Dr. Kendi had to convey during our 40-minute long conversation. It is well worth you leaning in for a better listen. I look forward to returning On the Yard in July with Season 2. But for now, Episode 9, Chain of Ideas with Dr. Ibram X. Kendi. Dr. Ibram X. Kendi, thank you for joining me for this episode On the Yard. I appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.
So just put you on the spot. This is our 9th episode On the Yard. Tell me your favorite episode so far.
Episode 1 through 8.
Oh, my That's a great answer. That's a great answer. And then 9 will be your favorite when we get going. Okay, so you are the Carter G. Woodson Chair and Professor of History here at Howard University. Tell me how special it is to have that title and to have that name attached to yours.
It's interesting because I think even as it's special, it's an honorific. I see it as almost a challenge in the sense that when your name is attached to someone who was so pivotal in our field, as an institution builder, as a scholar, as someone who's making his work accessible for everyday people, I feel renewed and challenged to ensure that I'm seeking to do the same. And so I think that's, to me, what makes it special. Like anything that can inspire you to try to do your best work. And so that's why I'm excited to be sitting in that chair.
It rings very true to me because father of Black history, but as you said, he tried to make his work, endeavored to make it, and in fact succeeded in making his work accessible. He's not speaking just to scholars. He's speaking to the public. And what I know of your work and the books you've written and your essays, even your social media, it strikes me as with that in mind to be accessible.
It is. And as you know, many historians complain about how history is being presented, let's say, to the public by non-historians. Right. And that we should be at the forefront of informing the general public about history. And so I feel like I'm trying to be one of the people who is doing that, and not just sharing my own work, but even sharing the work of other historians, because as you know, we're doing incredible work, but it's another sort of process of really translating it, for the public.
But we're not trained to do, that's the problem, is we're not trained as historians. And now I know you were a journalism major at FAMU, right?
Yeah.
And that, I think that helps with the writing, because a lot of us feel like if your work does not reward the patience of the reader, then it's not real work. And therefore, and I've lamented many, many times on this podcast and elsewhere, people don't get their history from people like us. And that's a problem.
It is. And I remember when I was in graduate school getting my PhD, I realized that in a way I was being taught to write a completely different way than I had been taught.
Not very creative.
As a journalist. Yeah, and how to essentially write for other academics.
Right.
And it's a completely different way of writing.
I think we're insecure about not being considered a science, social science. So we try to be technical as opposed to readable, accessible. If it's too accessible, then it's not real science, And what I always tell my students also, when they finish a paper, read a novel and then go through and edit. So you get that kind of technical
language, you can loosen up the prose a bit. I try to read novels as I'm working on my own books so that I don't fall into that technical trap.
Yeah, and I can't speak for other scholars, but to me, historians, at our core, we should be storytellers, right? And what makes us, to me, the best storytellers of the past is that we were able to share the nuance and complexity and the context. But there's a way in which we can clarify that nuance, that context,
Right.
that complexity in ways that people can understand.
That's one thing that we aim to do at Moorland-Spingarn, because we're not just an archive. We try to share history in a multiplicity of ways. So museum, exhibitions, the International Black Writers Festival, which you were part of, the podcast itself. And we want to be out in the public more. And so we could bring history to people, because not everyone digests food in the same way. Not everyone likes the same food. So you have to bring it to them to serve these different palates. So what's the goal for the Endowed Chair? You could bask in the glory of having Carter G. Woodson attached to your name, but you don't strike me as that kind of person who just wants to bask.
To me, it actually directly connects to my work helping to build this new Institute for Advanced Study. And so I think Carter G. Woodson was many things, and likely the thing that he potentially is the most remembered for is the institutions and programs and the month, or the week at the time.
Journal of Negro History.
Yeah.
Association for Negro Life and History.
Yeah, that he built. So really, to me, the goal is to build an effective and impactful Institute for Advanced Study while I'm also continuing to pursue my scholarship. But it's hard, as an institutional builder and leader, it is hard to really balance.
It's very hard.
Both.
Yeah, it is.
But we can receive inspiration from what's
right. Many people, when they are building or running an institute, they take a leave, formal or informal, from actual writing. And I'm finishing a book right now. I've been finishing it for about a year. It's been done for a long time, but you're still trying to work. But it's a different brain, like reading emails, responding to emails, being on teams, having these small conversations, and then sitting back and going through your research and then writing. It's almost like you have two different sides of your brain working. You have to shut one off in many respects.
It is, and that's why I try to, when I'm thinking about organizing my time, put each in completely different pockets of time.
Try to. Yeah, that's like the novels. I'm doing my academic work or my administrative work. I'll read a New Yorker essay to help me transition, and then I go into my academic work. Speaking of basking, when I was coming in, I was telling you that today was graduation, and very proud of my son. Graduated today. People are asking me how I feel about that. I think you said that, right? How do you feel about it? I said, yeah, I feel great. Obviously, very proud of him, but I'm still processing. But one thing I always feel at Howard's graduation, same at FAMU or Spellhouse, is, and I say this about homecoming, I think commencement at HBCU even more so, it just shows the lies about us that even we believe. When you have a room full of thousands of people who worked hard 4 or 5 years, and these PhD students who worked hard for 7 years plus the 4 before, no police officers around, everyone is, there celebrating knowledge. It's almost like a ritual that everyone should see at least one time in their life, and because we consume the same media, so we believe the same lies. And at graduation, I marvel at how true these lies ring to even us often, that's shocking that there's a room of thousands of people who celebrated knowledge for 4 years.
It's interesting when you say that, because in studying the history of anti-Black racist ideas, one of the most pivotal, if not the core idea, is the notion that Black people are intellectually inferior, that Black people are more conducive to animals who apparently are not intellectuals. And so to be able to witness thousands of people who are being crowned as intellectuals, frankly, year in and year out, right? Certainly, as you mentioned.
Across the East Coast and throughout the South with all of our schools. And that's not even counting the people who are at PWI. It's historically predominantly white institutions. Yeah. So tell us your Howard journey. How did you end up here, not just in this seat talking to me, but as a faculty member and a part of the Howard community?
I think in many ways, my Howard journey started when I was a FAMU student.
Is that right?
And partly because at the time, when I was a FAMU student in the early 2000s, the only other HBCU that we felt could even compete with us was Howard.
I love them. Every HBCU says that, we are the best, and we always think about Howard.
Yeah,
except for maybe Spelman. I don't think Spelman does that.
Exactly. And so I always had a certain level of respect for Howard students and even particular Howard alumni, because I think the way Howard alumni moved in the world was similar to me the way I saw FAMU alumni, in which you couldn't tell them nothing.
Yes,
right.
Right.
And so I think it started there. And then when I became a scholar, particularly an historian of ideas, particularly of Black intellectual history, every single book I wrote came through Howard in terms of the people that I was writing about, the students in the case of my first book who were organizing or those who were challenging racist ideas or striving to be anti-racist. All of those historical figures had come through Howard. In many ways, I, at least as a researcher, was constantly on Howard's campus historically and throughout the ages. And so when Dr. Frederick actually engaged me, we started to have a conversation about me coming to Howard.
No-brainer.
It certainly was something I had always considered.
It's amazing what you say. The sit-in movement began here at Howard in 1943 with Pauli Murray and a group of other female students coming from the Quad and going down to U Street. Stokely Carmichael, starting on here on the Yard and going down on the Freedom Rides. But again, one of the reasons why we launched this podcast is that we don't know that history. You learned it as a researcher, but we don't do a good job of speaking to all of these unique experiences, stories, individuals that have passed through the Yard.
Yeah, and it's interesting because when we even think of desegregation, I think many people are obviously familiar with the role of Howard law faculty.
Right,
but there were a whole host of other faculty who were essentially involved. So even the faculty who supervised the DAL tests of the Clarks when they were Howard students.
And a lot of that happened in Founders, the browsing room upstairs, because the law school is actually on the third floor of Founders Library at the time. So much of it happened right there where Moorland-Spingarn is located.
But I think we also don't talk enough about the role Howard faculty played in decolonization.
Right.
From faculty like Ralph Bunch, or even the role in which students who would go on to become prime ministers, right? And
diplomats.
Yeah.
Krista Johnson, Dr. Johnson, African Studies, is writing a book on the Howard School.
Oh, nice.
So she's tapping into that. Maris Tate, Ralph Bunch, Rayford Logan, the people who went off to be diplomats, and even people went off to become prime minister. Ezekiel started here. He finished at Lincoln. Yeah. But, there's all these Howard references. I knew something was up when you came to the Writers' Festival. I've never told you this story. So you came to the Writers' Festival, it must have been 2023 in the fall, October. And I went up to see Dr. Wutaw, our provost, and you were coming out of his office. I said something's up. I said something, and then, a year later, it was very clear. So I'm excited. And I love also how you could have gone anywhere. You've had enough success where you probably could have just chosen, but you chose Howard for the reasons you named, but you didn't just come here. You're at department meetings, you're advising students, you're teaching these courses. What's spurring that? Because you don't have to do that.
Well, part of the reason why I wanted to come to Howard was because of the intellectual community, right? And that intellectual community is comprised of faculty and students in particular. And so I want to be a part of that community. I want to learn from students and faculty. I want to support the work that they're doing. I mean, so much of the world has been transformed because of that community, right? And so I want to be a part of it.
Let me shift gears, go back to IBWF 2, 2023. I don't think you were at this session. I think you had departed already, but it was the final day. And there was a panel, and I won't say who was on the panel, but they kept referencing white people and white racism, white people, white racism. And the challenge is this, and Black folks can't do this because of white folks, on and on and on. I was sitting next to a friend of mine. I actually known him all my life, and he's a Howard alum. He said, y'all just are obsessed with white people. And so he said, I'm going to ask, I know him, I'll say, it was Sid Money. His name is Sidney Hall. He would love the fact that I'm shouting him out. So Sydney walks to the front of the room. I said, "Oh my Lord," because Sydney, he's anyone who knows Sydney Hall, they're smiling right now because he's an amazing human being, but he's also a provocateur. He goes to the front. He says, "Can you imagine a world without whiteness?" They basically laughed him off the stage. Like, there will always be whiteness. Whiteness is a shapeshifter. As you kill it, it will reinvent itself. He said, use your imagination. If you can't imagine a world without whiteness, not white people. We're not talking about, we don't want to eliminate white people, but the idea of whiteness, then what are we even doing? They thought that was the most ridiculous thing anyone had said in those 3 days of the gathering. Next panel is Greg Carr, and he said there's only been one decent question at this entire festival, and that was that brother at the last session, because he's getting to the fundamental issue that we're grappling with. So I'm going to ask you the question. Can you imagine a world without whiteness?
Well, first, I would say that through the better part of human history, whiteness, that's this construct didn't exist. And so the construct of whiteness really only started to emerge in the 15th century.
So we can imagine, we only need to go to the past
exactly
to see a world without whiteness. Go ahead.
Exactly. And so I think, to me, someone who can't imagine a world without whiteness is someone who's like, it's their own conception of history is only a modern conception of history.
That's right.
And the other thing I think is I was fortunate enough to be born in a Black community, Jamaica, Queens. I was fortunate to pretty much all of the social circles that I was in, from churches and others, were Black, went to FAMU. Even, when I went to a historically white institution, I was in a Black studies department.
Sure.
And so I was pretty much, was raised both as a human being and as an intellectual in Black spaces. And so when you're raised in Black spaces, then you're able to even begin to know a world where whiteness isn't necessarily dominant.
But when you say, because I grew up in a similar space, Black church, Black professionals all my life. I feel bad when I encounter students when they say this is the first time in their life they've been around Black professionals. I'm like, that's your parents' problem. Your parents did that to you, because that's a choice. But in many ways, these institutions that you're describing are a product of whiteness. So we can say, like, when we're at Howard, we can forget about the fact that we are Black and just be people. But Howard exists, the Black church exists, these Black communities exist because of the problem of whiteness.
So I certainly think that they're in part a product of white racism, but there are other elements of it that aren't necessarily a product of white racism.
Okay.
So to give an example, the cultures that we
right.
And so for me, particularly the cultures that Black people have built, there's been certain assimilationist oriented, and so that was a product of whiteness, but the more Afrocentric forms of culture that we built, whiteness wasn't necessarily predominant.
So in spite of the whiteness.
In spite of the whiteness.
So like Ta-Nehisi's line, it's in the book. I assume it's him. He might be quoting someone. They made us a race. We made ourselves a people. That needs to be on a t-shirt. I love that.
What's also striking to me is, speaking about that example you mentioned, is when you are in a crowd, let's say you're at Howard, and let's say you're talking about race and racism, and most of the people in the crowd are Black, if not everyone, and you're continuously talking about white people. That to me is also a demonstration of what even, Tony talked about as the white gaze. Because you can even talk about race and the way in which race is operating within Black spaces. You could talk about colorism. You could talk about notions that particular Black groups are superior to others. You could talk about class sort of divides within the Black community, in which certain people have believed this notion that Black poor people are lazy and folks with money are not. You can talk about all different aspects of these ideas and forms of internalized racist ideas without talking about white people at all. Right.
That's like Dana Williams said this, who's dean of the graduate school here at Howard, on episode 1, saying that if it's going on in the Black community, our HBCUs need to be addressing it, not as Black problems, Black issues, things of relevance to Black people, but things that are part of our community. Right. I noticed in the book here, you capitalize white The white caught my attention because everyone capitalizes B now. Are you inclined to capitalize both, or was that an editorial choice?
I'm inclined to capitalize both.
Why?
And the reason is because I think it's important to distinguish between white or even black as a racial category and black and white as a color.
Right.
So that's the main reason. And the other reason, particularly as it relates to capitalizing white, is we're living in a moment in which racist theorists are pushing the idea that white people are not racial. That majority white districts are not about race, but majority black districts
are. I'm just white. Right.
Yeah. And so I'm just normal.
I'm
human,
normal. Yes.
Right. And so I think that by ensuring that people understand that white is a race too.
And they are, they are a racial group.
Exactly. That's the main reason.
And they have racial politics. When we talk about racial issues, it's like those are black issues. They have nothing to do with white people.
No, they're primarily white issues.
Yeah. I mean, it's 90% of them, right?
Yeah.
We're on the receiving side. When I talk about racism, racist acts, or enslavement, I put the white in front of it. Because we have these non-actors, these people. Who are these racists that we're talking? No, it's not just race. They're white racists. We have to put them as actors behind it.
Yeah.
Let's go back to Queens. You were 15 when you went to Manassas. That's a big change, brother. From South Jamaica, Queens to Manassas. I went to Manassas one time. It's only because I got on the wrong Amtrak going back to New York. And I ended up in Manassas, Virginia for the day. Thank goodness it was a Sunday. There's some great games on TVs. But that train does not come often. What was that like switching? You went to Stonewall Jackson High School. That is ironic.
Yeah, I mean, it was the opposite in almost every way imaginable.
Right.
You know, majority black community going to a majority white. You know, in the city, suburb, place everyone has heard of, in Queens, to a place that's a smaller town that most people haven't heard of. Black people in New York City having a certain sense of pride, having, developed, let's say hip hop and other things that are.
It's like being from Howard.
Yeah.
You just know that you are the world and everything.
To going to Manassas, where they weren't necessarily like known for creating things, even as, black folks create things wherever they are.
Did it feel like a suburb of DC or is its own?
It felt like a suburb of DC.
Okay.
My parents even worked in DC, or around DC, and they commuted in.
It felt far to me.
It is, yeah. It's probably like from Howard, it's probably like 45-minute drive with no traffic. At least.
Okay, that's
not an hour.
That's suburb. So Stonewall Jackson High School, to have that name, was that a conversation? Because this is, what year would this be? 90?
This was 97.
2000. Okay, so we hadn't really started the conversation around.
Yeah, it was a little bit of a conversation, but it was just, not only was the high school and even the middle school was named after Stonewall Jackson. And
they were going hard for Stonewall Jackson.
Manassas is also a place where they have these battlefields.
I did see that. Yeah,
where,
Battle of Manassas.
People come, particularly Confederates, to reimagine the battles of Bull Run. And so, again, to go to this place where people honor the Confederates from a place like Queens, to
and in the
place,
mid-90s when the culture was so vibrant, Afrocentricity was still a thing, and hip-hop was a very different genre of music, and then to go to the Confederacy.
But to me, the benefits of it is I got to see a different side of Black America. I got to see a different side of the United States in general. And I remember my first night in Manassas, I'm 15, I couldn't sleep because I thought the Klan was going to come. That's what you grew up in New York City or in Virginia.
Once you cross that line.
Yeah.
Yeah. Did you all protest, try to get the name changed, or it was just a conversation?
It was just a conversation.
Just a conversation. Okay. I guess it was a little early for that. And then you're off to FAMU. So you were there, you graduated 2004. What was FAMU like in the early 2000s?
Well, when I got there, FAMU was still riding high because I think in 97, it had been named College of the Year.
Is that right?
It was recruiting more National Merit Scholars than any other school in the country. And the president, Frederick Humphreys, was really this sort of larger than life figure who really took FAMU from into the national sort of conversation among HBCUs over the course of the 90s. It was towards the tail end of his presidency. And then the Marching 100 was marching 500 people and was, of course, at the top of its game. You know, it had just performed in Paris. And so there was a tremendous amount of pride, you know, in being a rattler. And I think that's what attracted me. I didn't go to Howard, meaning I didn't tour Howard because I felt it was too close. But of all the colleges that I toured, there was something about just the pride that people had in FAMU. Every time I go back, it does feel like a sense of home. And at the same time, I think there's been so many changes, particularly as a result of this current governance administration, that it's fairly different than when I was a student there.
Just the state of Florida in general in the school, what they have to deal with.
But the irony, right, is Andrew Gillum, you know, when he ran for governor, he almost won.
Yeah.
And my freshman year, I believe, he was the SGA president at FAMU.
Okay.
And he actually was involved in the demonstrations against the Bush administration, sort of helping Jeb Bush's administration, helping his brother win the presidency.
Which he said he was going to do.
Yeah.
He made it very clear that he's going to ensure that he wins Florida.
So I come in as a freshman, you know, into that environment of FAMU students and even leaders like Gillum. And of course, he later runs against DeSantis. And, you know, again, he almost wins, right? So let's say he wins. I could imagine that FAMU is much more similar to the place, and frankly, even better, right, than when I was, you know, a student.
I was listening to a New York Times article talking about Florida and I forgot the program, but they created an alternative to college boards, AP. These exams are centered around patriotic history. And there are academics around the country who are taking that seriously. This teaching of patriotic history. Once this succeeds in Florida, and then Texas is doing the same thing, I'm worried about what the university is going to look like in 10 years.
I saw some of those reports. I think this is a situation in which you have media organizations describing this as, quote, conservative history, or arguing that this is a conservative approach to history. And
that is just an approach.
And to me, the challenge is when you frame it as a conservative approach, then you also create another frame that there's apparently a liberal approach, in that apparently you're saying that if let's say a so-called conservative administration is in power, they can teach it in one way. And so then history fundamentally becomes partisan sort of politics, as opposed to that what they are seeking to introduce is a much more obvious form of propaganda. Like that's really what it is.
And then they label what they might say liberal history as a liberal propaganda.
Exactly.
Making white kids feel bad about their ancestors.
So they institute propaganda and then reframe history as indoctrination or propaganda.
I was saying, I'm worried the way it's going to creep up to other states and then shape higher education. But then it just occurred to me, I have a friend whose child is in a private high school in New York City, and they took away the Black Studies curriculum. And this is at a private liberal. I won't say the name of the school. So it's more than just more than just creeping.
And it's interesting because I remember, you know, our colleague Nicole Hannah-Jones, her book 1619 Project that I contributed to, and I remember there was a review in the Washington Post about that book. The reviewer described my essay as, quote, political. And the essay was arguing that our conception that there was this continuous form of racial progress is ahistorical. And I literally wrote 5,000 words wide in showing how this conceiving of American history as this straight line of racial progress is ahistorical, and it's actually there's actually much more evidence to point to the fact that there has not only been forms of progress, but there's actually racism itself has progressed over time.
It's a ridiculous notion, in fact.
Yeah.
Right? To think that history is progress.
Yeah. And so I pushed back against that notion.
And that becomes
my
political.
essay was called Political, as opposed to the existing idea that's shared, frankly, by both liberals and conservatives, right? And so this is part of a larger problem that we're facing, even as Black intellectuals, because when we interject and push back against these common narratives that even white historians have, we're called political, as opposed to the position that they have been putting forth for years is considered political.
And this is one of the things that I got from your book, and it had me thinking, maybe this conversation also, you talk about the distractions. They create distractions while they are hoarding wealth, resources, and power. They distract us with these issues. And I wonder if this conversation around history is also a way to distract us, get us angry about what's going on in Florida and Texas and the AP while they continue to accumulate power and assert authority and this growing authoritarianism, which we already are under because of our political system.
Yeah, that's certainly an effect.
And I think about this poll. What percentage of the world is white? People say 40%, 45%. We're moving toward 2050 when a quarter of the world's population will live in Africa. That's what I'm thinking. Okay, preparing for a world without whiteness, even when the world is a quarter African. And we're not even talking about the Caribbean, and there's going to be a massive Black presence in Europe, of course, North America. What will they then resort to? How extreme will it be? And maybe that's the point where we can't imagine a world with. I'm just being provocative. We can, but
well, in their mind, the world would no longer exist. I mean, that's what apparently even people like Elon Musk, says that civilization is dying, and then he points to birth rates in the quote unquote West and in Eastern sort of Asia, even as when you look at, let's say, sub-Saharan African countries, they have pretty significant birth rates, right? So it's their conception of what is civilization, what is humanity, is deeply genetic and biological, even as they imagine themselves as not racist.
So what began this project, Chain of Ideas, the origins of our authoritarian age? Well, what were you thinking? What was the germ that became?
Well, I was trying to understand why more and more people were consenting to their own domination. And so I think, and the reason why I say consenting to their own domination, I think we, particularly those of us who study race and racism, have been talking for a long time about, let's say, white people acting against their own interests.
Well, they say they vote against their interests. Yeah.
So it's one thing to vote against your interests. It's another thing to literally consent to somebody dominating you. So thereby the rise of authoritarianism, inviting dictators and authoritarians, empowering them and supporting them, as it frankly has been happening increasingly over the last 2 decades. So I was trying to understand why.
Were you thinking of the U.S. or were you thinking?
I was primarily thinking of the U.S.
Because this
initially.
is more than your other work. More of a global take.
So I was primarily thinking of the U.S. But then when I went on a search to really understand how and why people were consenting to their own domination, that's when I arrived at Great Replacement Theory. And once I arrived at Great Replacement Theory, it's not a history that can be told in a U.S. only with the sort of U.S. nation state. It truly has been transnational.
As you say, Russia, even India. You're saying that it's global, and that you want it to be clear that it's a U.S. issue and a global issue. But one might say that you are being provocative because it is in their interest to have someone who speaks against big government, someone who sees the U.S. as the policeman of the world. I know a lot of conservatives are against that. But basically, it's not authoritarianism to them. They voted for who they wanted to be in power. And the party that best represents God and country, because there's a huge religious aspect in this as well, no?
Well, what's interesting is that's precisely what they believe, right? They're certainly voting for these politicians who they believe will support them, empower them, help them, increase their livelihoods. What these politicians are saying to them is that their livelihoods are being stolen by those Black people, by those immigrants, by those Muslims. And so I'm going to protect you
They're
by
line
going after
skippers.
that.
They're skipping lines, right?
Yeah.
To get goods that are rightfully mine.
And so then what happens is, as these authoritarians distract their own supporters into attacking or going after, let's say, the other people, they're better able to rob and exploit them, just as they are the rest of us, right? I think that's really the story, and it's a story that's being told all over the world, where you have people who are struggling or who are not in a particular piece of status. And let me give an example. One of the emerging issues that's happening around the world, and certainly an issue in the United States, is housing insecurity, in which you have people who are living, let's say, in major urban centers, and they're struggling to find affordable housing. And so you have elected officials who are saying, you can't find housing because there's so many immigrants.
Right.
At the same time, those elected officials are allowing developers to create these huge sort of luxury
With their tax dollars.
condos with their tax dollars for one person or no one to be in, which of course is then decreasing the overall housing stock and driving up the price. So then the person is like, I can't get a house because of those immigrants. And then they vote in the person who's actually ensuring that they can't get a house.
Or my tax dollars are going to their health care and they're in our schools, they're riding our trains with our tax dollars. And so they're robbing from us. But again, going back to, it's really not an obsession of mine, I promise you. I'm at Howard University. So we have the luxury of not having to think about this all the time. Whiteness is kind of the inverse of stamped from beginning. So from the beginning, whiteness has been a way to plunder, to take things. Whether we say, oh, well, the Native Americans, God has ordained that they're going to die out anyway. So taking their land is not a big moral crisis. They're not doing much with the land, which we know is false. Or Africans are going to die out anyway. And they're not doing anything with that gold and those diamonds in the ground. It's better use, and it's okay that we brought Africans over here to work. They're better off here than in Africa. They've been stealing and plundering in the name of whiteness without calling it whiteness from the beginning. So what's different now?
I think what is different is it's at every point in time of the plunder, they have created and fashioned or spread ideas, particularly racist ideas, to not only justify the plunder, but to also get masses of white people and even some people of color to support that plunder.
But even the poor white farmers, or even the mildly successful white farmer, was in competition with the plantation owners. They were better off without the enslavement of African people. When they fought in the Civil War to protect something that was against their interests in the 1860s, plantation owners that had, a certain number of enslaved Africans did not have to go and fight. Or if they had 3 sons, they only had to send 1. Am I getting that?
Oh, you're getting that.
So there's always this plunder in the name of whiteness, or in the protection of whiteness, as a kind of a shadow, confusion to steal the stuff. And there's always been lesser endowed whites who buy into whiteness.
And I think that we have to recognize that those super powerful racist white authoritarians are thinking about 2 major groups when they're creating and producing and spreading these ideas. They're thinking first and foremost of peoples of color and trying every which way to get them to believe that their status of having less resources is normal because there's something wrong with it. So you could have a Black person who's impoverished and they have consumed and internalized the idea that Black people are lazy. And so that's why so many Black people are impoverished. That then leads that person to not resist their poverty. But they've also...
Or policing, as we had in the 80s when our neighborhoods were so dangerous.
Yeah.
They had to throw all this money at the police.
And this goes all the way back to the enslaving era, where you had, let's say, enslavers who would bring white preachers onto their plantations to preach to enslaved people that God has commanded their enslavement. They are the cursed descendants of Ham. So literally trying to get Black people to believe they should be enslaved. So that's one group. The other group, of course, is everyday low and middle income white people, so that they won't resist the oligarchy. And in this context, particularly over the last 20 years, with the inequality within white America and the growing inequality between white America and peoples of color in, let's say, North America and Europe and the global South, they had to create a new justification to essentially maintain their power. And that new justification is great replacement theory.
It makes me think about Obamacare, the narrative around we have the best healthcare system in the country. Don't take away our healthcare and change it to a government program. And it was as if working class white people were saying this, but they weren't saying it, right? And so the narrative is powerful and persuasive, even for non-white people, because we consume the same media. Going back to the idea of replacement theory and Renaud Camus, how did you pinpoint him specifically? Because his ideas are throughout the book.
First, let me say, great replacement theory is an old idea. Right. It really emerged in the late 1800s among white colonial officials who imagined that if one day decolonization came, that, let's say, African people wouldn't stop at freeing themselves, that apparently they would try to colonize Europe. But this idea, of course, it was an idea that circulated around the United States. It was an idea that Hitler used, during his formation of Nazi ideology, but it wasn't named. And so Renaud Camus named this idea when he wrote a book called The Great Replacement in 2011. And so now this idea had a name. And I should mention that ideas, unlike people, can live without being named.
Right.
And so that's why he became a pivotal historical figure, because he named this very old idea that now was resurfacing and spreading globally.
And becomes powerful, similar to Raphael Lemkin in just genocide. Yeah. You have an uncanny ability to be timely with your work, because How to Be an Anti-Racist emerged in this particular political moment in the United States. And that really, shot you into the stratosphere. And I feel like this one is also very, very timely. Are you feeling the mood? Are you feeling the political mood and that's spurring you on to write about these topics? Or are you just lucky? Or both?
Oh, I definitely think there's luck. But I'll also say, I think there is something to historians. I don't want to say we can see the future, but like we recognize trends.
Trends, right.
Right. And so when there's a trend that's emerging, we can see that trend, and based on our knowledge of history, we can theorize where that's going to head.
We know that arc is not bending toward justice.
Exactly.
It's bending in the opposite direction. Yeah. So let's come back to the yard before we close out. 10 years from now, when you're looking back and you're walking across campus with your kids, what are you going to be bragging about? What did you do? What did you accomplish that brings you joy 10 years from now?
Well, I think 10 years from now, we would have presumably had about 8 different cohorts of fellows at the Institute for Advanced Study. And that means we have been supporting all these intellectuals and creators who are Howard faculty, non-Howard faculty, people who are not even professors, who are engaging in anti-racist research projects. So we'd be able to look back at all of that.
How many fellows per cohort?
So
in your wildest dreams?
By then, hopefully, we have over 10.
Okay.
Right? We're probably going to start somewhere between 3 and 5. But, I certainly would be proud of that. I would be proud of the Emancipator. I'm hoping to relaunch it.
Tell the listeners what the Emancipator is about.
It's a digital platform that's a reimagining of an anti-slavery newspaper. And just as we had anti-slavery newspapers that were critical in allowing people to understand the scourge of racism, but more importantly, the people who were working against it, we've created a similar newspaper, an anti-racist newspaper that chronicles really the spread and deepening in this time of racism. But more importantly, those who are imagining a different type of world, as we were talking about.
And when is that going to launch?
We're hoping to relaunch it sometime this summer.
Oh, so you have the Center with the Fellows, you have the Emancipator, and what's the trinity on your golden years at Howard?
Well, and then certainly the students that I was able to work with in my classes, students who were interning at the Institute, students who I was able to just, build relationships with outside of the institute, or even, my classes, seeing those students who are coming back with their families or who are now in a professional role and they're coming back to collaborate somehow at Howard. I mean, that certainly would be something that I would see as success.
Well, as I'm walking across the yard with you and by then 20-something-year-old children, your two daughters, right? I hope we're walking past the Howard University Museum, that I'll get accomplished.
Yes.
Not in 10, hopefully 5 years. Any well-endowed listener who wants to have their name on a building on Georgia Avenue, please contact me. I'm easy to find. Congratulations on the book, man, Chain of Ideas. This is big book number 4. You have the children's book, How to Be an Anti-Racist. You have the documentary, Stand from the Beginning. I'm an admirer of your publicly accessible academic work, so I'm proud of you. I'm proud to call you my colleague, and thank you for joining me on The Yard.
Thank you. Always fun.
Thank you for joining us on The Yard, the podcast of the Moorland-Spingarn Research Center, a University FM production, and produced by MSRC's very own Aaron Jacobs. I am Dr. Benjamin Talton. We look forward to seeing you again on The Yard.